Hi everyone, I'm Chesh from Cheshire Plays Games, and this video is sponsored by Wizards. Thank you very much, Wizards, for the commander decks for this series of videos. What we're going to be going through is a number of things. The first one is we want to identify what the commander decks are really good at and how we can change them up to make them work even better so that you can bring it to the table, play against people, and have a lot of fun. A few caveats here. The first one is that anything like fetch lands can't be done, because fetch lands are quite expensive, not everyone has access to them. So we're going to be trying to build around cards that you should be able to get your LGS pretty easily. So we'll get into that in just a second. We're going to talk about all of the resources that you can use to build your deck as well. First up, some resources. So the first one that you can look at for a good idea is EDHREC. So EDHREC.com is a great tool for you to have a look at other decks that are on the net. This will allow you to go through and have a look at maybe a couple of the commanders from the actual deck itself and get some great ideas on how you want to build the deck, such as this one for the human tribal deck. The other thing that you can do, of course, is have a look on Wizards' own site called Gatherer. From this, you'll actually be able to search up humans, for example. So your search criteria, you can fool around with it a bit and try and figure out what you might be missing from the deck that you perhaps want to have a look at, or what cards actually contain the text that relates around humans. Alright, now that we got that out of the way, and even though these decks out of the box are pretty good, let's go and have a look at what upgrades we can make to them so we can focus them a little bit more around what it seems like the deck wants to do. Let's go to that now. Today's deck is Arcane Maelstrom, headed up by Kalamax the Stormsire. Alright, so looking quickly through this deck, we can see that this is pretty much an instance matters deck, or an instance tribal deck. This is a little bit wacky, but when Kalamax is in play, whenever you cast your first instant spell each turn, if Kalamax the Stormsire is tapped, you get to copy that spell. You can choose new targets for that copy. So already right out of the gate, this deck seems a little bit bonkers. Whenever you copy an instant spell, put a +1/+1 counter on Kalamax. Now, we are going to look at the other commanders, but it's clear from the outset that the box starting commander for this particular deck is likely the one to go with, because that is very strong. Having the ability to get Kalamax to the point where Kalamax might be 1 or 2 hitting an opponent with commander damage out of the game is pretty amazing. Next up, we have Xyrus the Writhing Storm. This is a flying snake leviathan. Whenever an opponent draws a card except the first one they draw in each of their draw steps, create a 1/1 green snake creature token. Whenever Xyrus deals combat damage to a player, you and that player each draw that many cards. Okay, so dealing damage when you're attacking and having to get that combat damage through is fine, but it's certainly not great, because there's a lot of effects in Commander that your opponent can probably just negate the attack or untap your creature or something like that. So as much as this seems pretty cool, I mean, it basically is just, if your opponent draws more than one card on their turn, create a 1/1 green snake. Nowhere near the power level of Kalamax. The partner commander for this deck, we have Halden and Peiko. Who's that good elemental hound? Peiko's a good elemental boy. Whenever Peiko Arcane Retriever attacks, exile the top card of each player's library and put a fetch counter on each of them. Put a +1/+1 counter on Peiko for each non-creature card exiled this way. Then we of course have Halden, which is the partner. You may play non-creature cards from exile with fetch counters on them if you exiled them. And you may spend mana as though it was mana of any colour to cast those spells. As much as I'm a big fan of particular big stompy red dinosaur with this similar effect, I really don't feel like these two could hold up this particular deck. This deck is absolutely all about twinning and winning. When I say that, we've got, of course, Twinning Staff. So this is if you would copy a spell one or more times. Instead, copy it that many times plus an additional time. You may choose new targets for the additional copy. For 7 colors and tapping, copy target instant or sorcery spell you control. You may choose new targets for the copy. So right out of the gate, we can tell that this deck is probably based around copying spells. So we've got Wart the Raid Mother. So when Wart the Raid Mother enters the battlefield, create 2 1/1 red and green goblin warrior creature tokens. Each red or green instant or sorcery spell that you cast has Conspire. This means that as you cast the spell, you may tap 2 untapped creatures you control that share a color with it, and when you do, copy it, and you may choose new targets for the copy. Swarm Intelligence. Whenever you cast an instant or sorcery spell, you may copy that spell. You may choose new targets for the copy. And Djinn Illuminatus. This is a flying Djinn 3/5. Each instant and sorcery that you cast has Replicate. The Replicate cost is equal to its converted mana cost. When you cast it, copy it for each time you paid its Replicate cost. You may choose new targets for the copies. So with this, you can actually get multiple copies out of a spell, which is pretty cool with Replicate. But we can now tell that we're very much on track to copying a whole bunch of spells and killing somebody with, I don't know, maybe a massive Comet Storm? Or perhaps drawing really deep into your deck with a Hunter's Insight. Here's a little bit of trivia. I've actually Hunted Insight 30 cards out of my deck. That is not a joke. This deck is incredibly powerful out of the gate. It is so good. But we're about to make a $50 upgrade that's going to make it even better. So first off, we need to figure out what exactly we want to take out of the deck. What doesn't fit in this particular deck? Well, starting with artifacts, we've got Lavabrink Floodgates and Bonder's Ornament. Both of them are basically mana rocks, although the Floodgates has a really unique ability that can deal 6 damage to each creature, but is extremely flawed in the fact that your opponents can actually start removing the counters when they're going on, so you have no real control over that board wipe. The Bonder's Ornament, you can make every player draw a card if they have a Bonder's Ornament, or you can pay 4 and tap it to draw a card. It's not really good enough for this deck, and it's quite expensive. We also have the 3 Impetus cards in this deck. Psychic Impetus, of course, was my preview card, which is linked down below. These just really don't fit in this deck at this point, because we want to cast big, awesome spells and do a lot of casting. When it comes to enchantments, we really don't need to waste these spots on goading our opponent's creatures. Primal Empathy is the last enchantment that we will remove. At the beginning of your upkeep, draw a card if you control a creature with the greatest power among creatures on the battlefield. Now, this does happen quite often because of Calamax, but this deck doesn't really need it. Otherwise, put a +1/+1 counter on a creature you control. So that can absolutely come out. Next up, we're going to start taking out some of the instants that we'll be replacing with some other cards. The first one, of course, is Prophetic Bolt. It deals 4 damage to a target, and then you get to look at the top 4 cards of your library, put one of those cards into your hand, and the rest on the bottom of your library in any order. For 5 mana for 4 damage, it's really not a terrible card, but we can actually find better things that we can use in the deck, rather than just hoping that we can deal 4 damage to something. Curious Herd comes out. Choose target opponent, and you can create X 3/3 green beast creature tokens, where X is the number of artifacts that player controls. Now, the one thing that you have to remember is that not everyone's going to be playing with a massive amount of artifacts. This will maybe net you 1 or 2 beasts on average, but certainly isn't going to be the game winner that we want it to be. Strength of the Chayur. This is multi-kicker 1, so you can pay an additional 1 any number of times as you cast a spell. Choose target creature, then choose another target creature for each time this spell was kicked, and put X +1/+1 counters on each of them. Again, this is not a terrible spell, but it certainly isn't advancing our game well enough. It's just putting +1/+1 counters on things. If Calamax is tapped, sure, you're going to be putting maybe 4 or 5 counters on Calamax, and then maybe 4 or 5 counters on another creature, but at the end of the game, is that really going to help you, because you still have to attack with those creatures? We're going to remove a Slice in Twain from this deck, because 4 mana to destroy target artifact or enchantment and draw a card is not good enough. It is too expensive. We can find cheaper things that are better. Evolution Charm. Choose one, search your library for a basic land card, reveal it, put it into your hand, and then shuffle your library. Return target creature card from your graveyard to your hand, or target creature gains flying until the end of turn. None of the modes on Evolution Charm are really good enough for this deck, and for 2 mana we can certainly find a better ramp spell. Clash of Titans. Now this is extremely expensive at 3 colors and 2 red, to have target creature fight another target creature. This is just not good enough removal, and we're going to take that out as well. Hunting Pack, create a 4/4 green beast creature token with Storm. This is extremely expensive for a Storm spell. Trying to pay 5 colors and 2 green and have spells cast before this to storm it out, even if you're copying this particular spell, is not good enough for this deck. Sad Robot, Solemn Simulacrum. This is an artifact creature golem 2/2 for 4 mana. When Simulacrum enters the battlefield, we get to search our library for a basic land card and put it onto the battlefield tapped. And when Sad Robot dies, you may draw a card. Again, just not really good enough for this particular deck. We've got other ramp that's just simply better. Etali Primal Storm. Now this does feel like it should fit this deck, but it really doesn't. Whenever Etali Primal Storm attacks, exile the top card of each player's library. Then you may cast any number of non-land cards exiled this way without paying their mana costs. Sounds like it should be pretty cool, but not every deck that you're going to be playing against is going to have an abundance of instants, especially instants that you can cast for yourself. So we don't want to worry about Etali at all. We're not playing those cards from our hand either, so that can have some synergy issues with other cards. We're going to take out Etali. Ravenous Gigantitherium. Yeah. I tried to say this so many times, and there's so many cuts of this where I can't say it. This has Devour 3. So when it enters the battlefield, you may sacrifice any number of creatures. This creature enters the battlefield with 3 times that many +1/+1 counters on it. When Ravenous enters the battlefield, it deals X damage divided as you choose among up to X target creatures, where X is its power. Each of those creatures... Oh, so much text. Deals damage equal to its power to Ravenous Gigantitherium. Okay, great. This is just not great in this deck. We do have some token makers in this deck, but really when it comes down to it, we don't want to be sacrificing our creatures. We need our creatures so that they can save us from imminent and certain doom. Aeon Frolicker. This is an elemental otter 5/5 for 4 mana with flying. Sounds pretty good. It is a good otter creature. When Aeon Frolicker enters the battlefield, if you cast it, target opponent takes an extra turn after this one. Let's not even finish reading the text. That right there says to me, no. I don't want to give my opponent an extra turn to be able to kill us. Not at all. That's straight out. Nascent Metamorph. When Nascent Metamorph attacks or blocks, target opponent reveals cards from the top of their library until they reveal a creature card. Nascent Metamorph becomes a copy of that card until the end of turn. Then that player puts all cards revealed this way on the bottom of their library in a random order. It's a 1/1. It's a 1/1 for 2 mana that's really easy to kill, really easy to block, and sometimes you're just going to get something really bad off the top of your opponent's library. This has to come out. Jace, Architect of Thought. I never thought I would take a Planeswalker out of a commander deck, but here we are. Jace just simply isn't great for this particular deck. I'm not going to read out Jace. Jace is just a little bit on the side of, yeah, you're good, but you're just not good enough. Also, the same with Rupture Spire, because we'll be replacing this with, of course, a land from Ikoria. Rupture Spire enters the battlefield tapped. When it enters the battlefield, you have to pay 1 or sacrifice it. Tap to add 1 mana of any color. We are a 3-color deck. We can absolutely find a better replacement for that particular land, which we'll get into right now. Okay, now that we've taken out our other backup commanders and all of those other cards that we just mentioned, we're going to start with a Ketria Triome from Ikoria. Seriously, a tapped land, but is fetchable, is just so good. This is a forest island mountain with cycling 3. So in the early game, put it into play tapped, provides 1 of one of the mana types that you need for your commander. That is your deck color. And late game, you can just cycle it to draw a card. Drawing a card in this particular style of deck sounds really neat. Speaking of drawing cards, this particular dinosaur likes to ride in vehicles. That's right, you want to be able to selectively have Calamax tapped anytime that you want to cast an instant to get that copy effect. So we're of course going to be playing Smuggler's Copter. Whenever it attacks or blocks, we get to draw a card. We're playing a Heart of Kiran because it has flying and vigilance. We have Fleetwheel Cruiser because it is trample and haste. We have Cultivator's Caravan because it's also a pseudo mana rock and a 5/5 creature when we make it into a creature. Holy dooly. And of course we have one copy of the Weatherlight, which is just because it's a big flying vehicle and not really because of its other meme. Next up, we want to look at some of the ramp elements that we want to change and make better, because remember that we want to play some bigger, more interesting spells and some X spells to kill off our opponent. To do that, we need to obviously have extra lands in play as fast as possible. So first up, we have Rampant Growth. Search your library for a basic land card, put that card onto the battlefield tapped, and then shuffle your library. We have a copy of Farseek. Search your library for a Plains, Island, Swamp, or Mountain card and put it onto the battlefield tapped, and then shuffle your library. We have a Sakura Tribe Elder. Sacrifice Steve, and then search your library for a basic land card, put that card onto the battlefield tapped, and then shuffle your library. We also have a copy of Genesis Ultimatum. Now, this is kind of in the ramp category, but not really, considering it's a 7-cost spell. But I tell you what, this can be really great. It breaks our rule of trying to play as many instants as possible because it's a sorcery, but you get to look at the top 5 cards of your library, put any number of permanent cards from among them onto the battlefield, and the rest into your hand, which is the most important part. This potentially could just draw you a whole bunch of cards. Next up, we want to look at some copying spells, but first up, a non-traditional copy spell, because Calamax is great, but also so is Spark Double. You may have Spark Double enter the battlefield as a copy of a creature or planeswalker you control, except it enters with an additional +1/+1 counter on it. If that permanent is legendary, Spark Double still enters as a copy of a non-legendary version of it. We can have 2 Calamax going at once, and I tell you, I've done it, and it's great fun. We have a copy of Narset's Reversal. So for 2 blue, we can copy target instant or sorcery spell, then return it to its owner's hand, and we can choose new targets for the copy. You can play this on your own copy spells, if you want to go infinite, which is super gross, and I know I don't condone it, or you can target one of your own instants that you play, put the copy onto the stack, and the original spell back into your hand, which doesn't get cast, so you can cast it next turn, which is fantastic. We have 1 copy of Rowstorm's Conduit. Whenever you cast or copy an instant or sorcery spell, it deals 1 damage to target opponent or planeswalker. For -2, which is the most relevant ability on this particular planeswalker, when you cast your next instant or sorcery spell this turn, copy that spell. You can choose new targets. This plus Calamax plus all the other copiers, holy dooly, we're going to get 4 or 5 or maybe even 6 copies of an instant on the stack at the one time, making Calamax massive. Speaking of extras, we're playing a copy of Bonus Round. This is 2 red and 1 colors for a sorcery. Until end of turn, whenever a player casts an instant or sorcery spell, that player copies it and then may choose new targets for the copy. Adding to the deck itself, just to make the deck a little bit better, we have 1 copy of Brainstorm, so that we can draw 3 cards and then put 2 cards from a hand back on top of our library in any order. Making copies of it, of course, because it's such a cheap card, is an easy thing to do. We have a copy of Fact or Fiction, which is amazing to play against your friends and leads to a lot of hilarity. Reveal the top 5 cards for your library. An opponent separates those cards into 2 piles. Put 1 pile into your hand and the other into your graveyard. You can fill up your yard just in case you decide to play other things to fetch instants out of your graveyard, for example, which we'll get to in a second. Or we can just basically use it as a selective tool and then aim it at different players just to get everyone at the table doing something, which is just so much fun. Speaking of ways to get stuff out of your graveyard, we are playing an Archaeomancer. This is a human wizard 1/2, and when it enters the battlefield, return target instant or sorcery card from your graveyard to your hand. We've added a copy of Jace's Sanctum from last year's Commander set. Instant and sorcery spells you cast cost 1 less to cast, so it makes them cheaper for you. Whenever you cast an instant or sorcery spell, you get to scry 1. That's pretty good for 4 mana for an enchantment, and it has a lot of play. We also run a copy of Coastal Breach, which has Undaunted, so this spell costs 1 less to cast for each opponent. Return all non-land permanents to their owner's hands. A copy of Nature's Claim to replace the other destruction spell that we removed. This is for 1 green, we can destroy target artifact or enchantment, and its controller gains 4 life. The last card that we'll talk about before we go into killing our opponents is Voracious Great Shark. Voracious Great Shark. Baby Shark, you're welcome. This has Flash. It is a 5/4, and when it enters the battlefield, counter target artifact or creature spell. A lot more relevant than you might think. Can just act as a blocker if you need to, or just flash it in and smack somebody in the face on your turn, or actually use it as a cool selective counterspell. To kill our opponents, obviously the deck already comes with a copy of Comet Storm, so we don't need to actually put another copy in, obviously. So this is multi-kicker 1, choose any target, then choose another target for each time this spell was kicked. Comet Storm deals X damage to each of them. So because we're copying our spells, that's pretty easy towards late game to spend 12 mana and hit somebody for 10 damage and then copy it and hit somebody else for 10 damage and so on and so forth, or even just burn out an opponent's face straight out of the game. Because we're playing so many instants and or sorceries, I guess, but mostly instants, we're going to put in a copy of Metallurgic Summoning. Whenever you cast an instant or sorcery spell, create an XX colors construct artifact creature token, where X is that spell's converted mana cost. For 3 colors and 2 blue, exile Metallurgic Summonings and then return all instant and sorcery cards from your graveyard to your hand. Activate it only if you control 6 or more artifacts. You are probably going to make a whole lot of constructs because you're going to be playing a whole lot of spells. Just remember, it's whenever you cast an instant or sorcery, it doesn't count copying and things like that. It has to be cast. Also, to help us potentially either combat infinitely with expansion or killing our opponents with explosion, we have Explosion, which deals X damage to any target, and then target player draws X cards. Again, the X spells really are an easy way to kill off your opponents. We have enough other stuff in here that we should be able to close out the game with, say, Calamax or something like that, but just in case, we absolutely have Expansion Explosion. And there you have it. The deck is upgraded, it's ready to go, to be brought to the table and smash some face. Thank you very much, Wizards, for sponsoring this content, and I hope that you all enjoyed it. Please like, comment, subscribe. Don't forget to catch us every Sunday for Commander the Distancing, usually around 11 AM Australian Eastern Standard Time, where we have some great international guests coming up as well. Don't forget to check out my writing at puremtgo.com, where I do some freelance articles on Commander and sometimes on Brawl and Standard.